Everybody's favorite pen. 14th BR 5786, Friday, May 1st. No one really knows for sure. Elevate, Elo, Dibre, Elohim, Chaim. But this is the Mizor with it by. Brukatadana. Makam Shirkat Shana Buktaban al Sefarat Ha'omer. Blessed are you, Hashem, God, King of the universe, who has sanctified us His commandments and commanded us concerning the counting of the Omer. Today is 30 days, which is 4 weeks and 2 days of the Omer. May the Merciful One restore unto us the service of the Beit HaMikdash to its place speedily in our days. Amen. Selah. (3761) Creation of the world. Birth of Adam and Eve. Chava. 3631 Seth, son of Adam, was born. 3526 235 Enoch, son of Seth, was born. 3436 325 Kenan, son of Enosh, was born. 3366 395 Mahalalel, son of Kenan, was born. I'm doing this bitch 126 days. Coffee and Kabbalah Fallen Coffee. I don't know which one of these bitches are on.
Necessary structure of reality. I'm Dr. Justin Sledge, and welcome to Esoterica, where we explore the arcane in history and religion. One of the most difficult aspects in starting to study Jewish mysticism and Kabbalah is getting a handle on just how those ideas developed over time. It's tempting to think that, for instance, Kabbalah has just always existed in the form that we have it, or that Kabbalah is just one thing at all. Of course, neither of these positions is really tenable. Such notions developed greatly through the ages and are still developing. And there are now, and there have always been, numerous mutually exclusive schools of Jewish mysticism and Kabbalah. This class is meant to serve as an introduction to Jewishism and Kabbalah from the point of view of its incredibly complex development from the prophets of ancient Israel and to the rise of modern Judaism in the 18th century. We only should serve as a reflection, and hopefully it will also enable you to situate developments in Jewish mysticism and Kabbalah in their historical and cultural context, and hopefully embolden you to dive in, which are admittedly as sublime as they are obscure. Let me express my gratitude to Congregation Tchia for allowing me to use these lectures to reach a larger audience here on Esoterica. If you want, you can find the entire series under the playlist Entering the Garden, an Introduction to Jewish Mysticism and Kabbalah. I'll be uploading them next few weeks, or if you find these episodes after autumn of 2021 and you want to watch the entire series, you can find them in that playlist. If you find this series on Kabbalah interesting, I'd hope you check out other content on topics of esotericism and perhaps consider supporting the production of free academic and scholarly topics in occultism, hermetic philosophy, by joining my Patreon or one-time donation. Find those links below, and we appreciate your consideration. Now, let's enter the garden of Jewish mysticism and Kabbalah. All right, folks. Well, we're about at 5 after, I'm going to pick up with some summary from last time, so we can all be on roughly the same page of completely mysterious books that no one really understands, which is great. That said, we'll do some summary, then we'll jump into it after. I'll open up things a little bit more for questions, just in case there's some lingering questions. And again, I say questions, I mean questions I can possibly answer. If you ask me questions like, how do I make a golem, I'll tell you, I have no idea, but here are 3 books in Aramaic that allegedly tell you how to do it. Go forth and have fun. So as we covered last time, we took a look at some of the really foundational texts that go on to form what I might call proto-Kabbalah. And anytime I hear the word proto-anything, it just sounds like completely pretentious academic speak. But what I mean here is these are going to be texts that are going to either underwrite, or they're going to deeply inform, they're going to give some really important terminology to what will become Kabbalah. But they're kind of bridge texts from the period before the rise of the Kabbalah, which we'll get to in earnest tonight. And they're texts that underwrite or undergird or allow or serve as a foundation for what's going to become the Kabbalah as you may know it, or as you don't know it and you're here to learn more about it, or you heard this word from Madonna or whatever. I think even Britney Spears, God bless her, has a Kabbalah tattoo, I think. I don't know. May the Lord help her. She needs help, and not she doesn't need help. The people that are doing terrible things to her, they need help. At any rate, the Sefer Yetzirah is probably one of the more famous of these books, and it's a very tiny little book. Like I said last time, in its normal recension, it's only a couple long, and it's a book of cosmogenesis, which is just a $2 word that means something like how the world came into being. We're still writing cosmogenic books, right? If you've ever read The Brief History of Time by Stephen Hawking, other kinds of books like that, we're still very interested in how the world came into being, and the Sefer Yetzirah is an early attempt to describe that using 2 different categories. The first category is the Sephirot of right, the Sephirot Belima. And as I talked about last time, we're not sure what these are. What we do know is that they're not divine emanations. And we know that because the text never refers to them as such and never even sort of invokes that notion. That notion is going to come a bit later, and we're going to see it in full force tonight for sure. And the other, of course, is the 22-letter Hebrew alphabet. And what we have in the Sefer Yetzirah is a story about how the world came into being, with God using the 10 Sephirot of nothingness, probably mathematical terms of some kind, right? Some kind of math term, and then the 22 letters of the Hebrew alphabet, and using those together, God hews creation out of nothing. And I love this image of hewing. God is sort of like hammering away and forms something. And it's I've always this image to be very beautiful because it doesn't have this sort of God just went and then everything came into being. It's a kind of working class God in the mind, building things out of nothing with numbers and letters. And I always appreciate the working class God hewing the world out of being. This is the Rosie the Riveter God. This is not the aristocratic God speaking from a throne from on high. So I appreciate that image a lot more. The wobbly God. What we have, right, in these images of the undergirding structure of Sefer Yetzirah is that word and being have a continuity. That language and speech and ontology and metaphysics are connected in a very deep, powerful way. Parmenides, this is echoing perhaps an idea going back to Parmenides, where Parmenides said that there is no difference between thought and being, between logos and antos. They're ontos and logos are the same. By the way, in philosophy, that idea has come roaring back in the 20th century and the 21st. And so, in many ways, we think of this as a pre-modern notion, but it's and a post-modern notion at the same time. The snake always swallows its tail. So, Sefer Yetzirah gives us an idea about how language and being relate to one another, and how being emerges from divine language. And again, the snake swallow its tail, right? It's also how one that speaks, us, we can also, because we speak, and if we can speak correctly, right? Not that I can, I'm Southern, but if we can speak correctly, right, we can force reality to our will. We can magically use reality to do what we want. And of course, that's going to underwrite the entire Golem legend. And that Golem legend, of course, we see all the way back, and at least as early as the Babylonian Talmud, where some rabbis were able to use Hilchot Yetzirah or Sefer Yetzirah to shape into being living creatures, whether they were calf or a human being. Now, they're not perfect, right? Because we never speak as well as God does. I don't know what dialect of Hebrew God speaks, but we never speak as well as God does. And the idea, right, I imagine that God speaks Yemeni Hebrew. I always love the way Yemeni sound. They have this, they still separate between all the different pharyngeal and glottal sounds that have been well lost to both Sephardi and Ashkenazic Hebrew. By the way, the Babylonian Talmud says that if you can't pronounce the difference between an ayin and an aleph, that God doesn't hear your prayers. It's a minority position, but I do like the rigorous attention to linguistic detail on the part of at least that rabbi. At any rate, what we have in the Golem legend is you can speak being into being. We can speak beings into being. They're people and even other animals. And of course, if you remember back to that line in the Babylonian Talmud, it says that if you're really righteous, you can speak an entire world into being, right? So this is a really incredible concept. It's not just that you can create people, right? That's already miraculous enough. But you can create an olam. You can create an entire world. And so this is a truly tremendous idea to be found in Jewish mysticism, reaching all the way back to the Talmud and, of course, to the Sefer Yetzirah, as it appears sometime before the 10th century. I say sometime before the 10th century because there's a position, which I think I named last time, but there's a lot of debate about when exactly this text comes into being. Now, over there in water that was Europe, again, we should always remember that Europe in the 10th century was a place that no human being in their right mind wanted to live because it was a dark ages movement of a bunch of barbarians killing each other. Back there in the backwater that was Europe in the early Middle Ages, we have some elements coming together in what is called Ashkenaz, that is to say, what we now call Germany. And again, Ashkenaz is sort of a more broad term for Germany, but sort of in the German milieu, where we have a couple of different mystical movements going on. And the two mystical movements that really matter for us are going to be what is called the Circle and what is also called the folks called the German Pietists, or the Chaste Ashkenaz. The unique church circle is going to be very important because they're going to develop a very unique theology in which they really center the idea of Ha'atzalut, right? And Ha'atzalut is the idea of, or Ha'atzalah rather, is the idea of emanation, which is to say that God doesn't just create being in the sense that there is God and there is being and God is outside of being. Rather, you can imagine it like, I always imagine those like really fancy weddings that have the big pyramids of champagne, right, where there's like one champagne, right, being poured at the top and it goes down all the different glasses. Well, imagine that there's an infinite amount of champagne and God is the champagne being poured down all the glasses, right, and all of those glasses are reality. And so, or whatever, or candles lighting one another, there's lots of images for this. I even heard one of like milk overflowing from when you boil milk. I don't know who boils milk, but apparently people. At any rate, so the idea, right, is that what you have is the idea that creator and creation are part of a continuum. They're part of a spectrum of reality where God is the most real thing and at some level it tatters off into non-being, right? It tatters off infinitely into non-being. And that's a very different conception of God's over here and then there's creation over there, and God and creation are distinct. So this idea emerges in the unique cherub circle. And remember that the unique cherub was a kind of individual angel, a very special kind of angel, Metatron maybe, that is able to be the outer glory of God. There is an inner hidden glory, God's inner transcendence, and then there's an outer glory, right? And that outer glory is the unique cherub, right? And then that unique cherub communicates the outer glory to the rest of the Olam, and that outer glory sort of echoes out into being. And that outer glory is part of what creates our world. I also mentioned the Chassidei Ashkenaz. There's a lot of debate about the Chassidei Ashkenaz at this point. An earlier theory of the Jewish mysticism claimed that it was an entire movement of Jewish mysticism in the early part of the 11th, 12th century in Germany, in the Ashkenaz. I don't want to say Germany because Germany conjures up so many ideas because of European Jewish history, and because Germany wasn't a state at that point. Germany was like a bunch of tiny little warring states, it's like saying you're the king of Hamtramck. Like, that's what Germany was. It was 300 Hamtramcks all wed together with a bunch of different kings. I like saying Ashkenaz because Ashkenaz communicates how amorphous the barriers are, right? What was Ashkenaz? If you want a general idea of where we're talking, if you know something about Germany, we're talking about the area around Regensburg. So you may know another famous mystic also from the area around Regensburg. That is Hildegard of Bingen. Hildegard of Bingen and the Chassidei Ashkenaz have lived in very close proximity to one another. At any rate, what's really important about them is they seem to preserve a lot of magical texts. They preserve a lot of the Hechelot literature. They preserve a lot of the amulet literature. They preserve a lot of this sort of strange ascetic literature that seems to have emerged at that time. And scholars now think is that rather than being a mystical movement in Judaism, it was a kind of particularly weird family who just so happened to be very, very powerful, right? Who happened to be actually very, very powerful and have a good bit of money and influence. And so the Chassidei Ashkenaz were famous in many ways because of the relative influence they had, and because they were literate. They were connected to the Kalonymus family, which was a big family down in Italy. And it seems like what ends up happening is a lot of works are coming in from North Africa and from the Middle Eastern world. They're entering in Italy, and they're being pushed into the Ashkenaz via the Kalonymus family. Also, just mention the Kalonymus family has one of the earliest examples of a possible transgender Jewish person poet. So we have a Kalonymus, one of the members of the Kalonymus family, writing a poem wishing that they were a woman, actually, and probably expressing some, again, something like a kind of queering transgendered identity at the poetic register in the Kalonymus family. That document is not terribly well known, but it is in a great collection of LGBTQ history in Judaism. And of course, as I'm sure you know, one of the main things that's going to make Kabbalah very interesting is how gender bending it is. That God is going to be female and male and masculine and feminine and neither of these things. And so part of what's going to make Kabbalah so fascinating is the gender bending that's going to go on. We'll talk a bit about that tonight. So out of the Kalonymus family and the Chassidei Ashkenaz, we don't know. They're also one of the few ascetic Jewish movements in history. That is to say, Jews who intentionally harm their bodies in order to get closer to God. Judaism doesn't typically have an ascetic dimension so much. They're fast, but they're very well constrained. You're not allowed to go beyond them. But the Chassidei Ashkenaz movement had lots of different penitential and ascetic practices, like rolling around naked in the snow to atone for your sins, which I guess in the wintertime here in Michigan, if you want to try out the Chassidei Ashkenaz practice, just take your clothes off and roll around in the snow and see if you're closer to God. Your mileage will vary. As I mentioned last time also, the other main text that's also critically important for the development of Kabbalah, as we'll get to tonight, is the Sefer Bahir. And the Sefer Bahir is the first time in which we have the idea coming from Sefer Yetzirah, right? Like that the world is formed from the Sefer of Belimah, the Sefer of nothingness, and from the unique cherub circle over there in Ashkenaz, we have the idea of Atzalah, of emanation. Those are in the Sefer Bahir slammed together. They're synthesized. And for the first time in the Sefer Bahir, we see the idea that God is in fact 10. That idea first appears in the Sefer Bahir. And so in that way, the Sefer Bahir is the first true Kabbalistic book. So sometimes people ask me, where should I start studying Kabbalah if I want to start reading Kabbalistic literature? Well, if you don't want things to be too complicated, start with the Sefer Bahir, because it's the first. Now, does that mean it's going to be the most introductory? No. Because if you've ever studied any philosopher or any mystic when they're trying to forge new ideas, synthesize and work with ideas that are half-formed and excuse me. Those ideas are very half-formed and they're very like groping at things. And a classic example of this is I tell people, right, if you want to read the first book of metaphysics, you can go read Parmenides' books, or you can go read Aristotle's book of metaphysics. Now, those are some of those difficult books about metaphysics they've written. Why? Because they're inventing it, right? They're inventing the very language by which you describe things that aren't physical. It's the most agile, so the language is very tough. And so this Sefer Bahir is notoriously difficult to understand. Now, again, is it always impossible to understand? No, but it's pretty hard. It's pretty hard. But again, I think the Bahir is a perfectly approachable text in lots of other ways. The other two things to say about the Sefer Bahir that are crucially important as we begin to get into Kabbalah is one, Sefer Bahir is a pseudepigraphic text. I like that I said pseudepigraphic without making a single mistake. Pseudepigraphic texts are just texts that are written as if they were being written by someone else, almost someone more famous than writing them. I don't know, Taylor Swift is probably not going to write a pseudepigraphic text because Taylor Swift is famous enough to write Taylor Swift, and Taylor Swift's going to sell her own book because she's magic. Well, if I write a book, I might attribute it to Taylor Swift. That's a probably bad idea because I'm pretty sure that she would sue me. But right, what I could do is attribute it to someone who couldn't sue me. So what I would attribute it to is Nakana bin Hakunya, right? A guy who lived 2,000 years ago in Palestine, and he had a kind of general mystical idea. That's exactly what these guys are doing. Or I contribute it to Enoch or Abraham or Moses or whatever. There's a long history of doing this in Jewish lore, and the Sefer Bahir is attributed to a first century sage. That same structure is going to be picked up by the Sefer Zohar, which we'll get to next time, and that text is being attributed to Shimon Bar Yochai, another second century sage, who's also very important for mystical stuff as well. The last thing I'll say about the Sefer Bahir is that there are what we might call Gnostic elements in the text. Gnosticism, as you may remember, was a religious current in the late classical world, and the late classical world, that second, third, fourth centuries, and it survived a little longer. In some ways, it survived even into medieval Europe in some ways. Then the Gnostic idea is the idea that there is the world is fundamentally dual, right? There is a good world and an evil world. The physical world is typically bad. The spiritual world is typically good. And the task is to get out of this prison world, right? We live in a prison world of physicality, and the task is to get out of that world. And we see some elements of that in the Sefer Bahir. And also, by the way, in the Sefer Bahir, it's one of the first times that we begin to see the idea of the feminine divine. It's there that we see Chokhmah, wisdom, being personified as divine. And that's going to be a huge shift in a minute as we get into the Kabbalah proper, because it's also going to be the time where the Shekhinah goes from not just being feminine gender grammar-wise, like it is in the Talmud, to being feminine gender divine-wise, the way it is in Kabbalah. So again, one of the things you'll see about when we get into Kabbalah is that often what makes Kabbalah very radical is not that it reads text in strange ways. What makes Kabbalah very radical is it typically reads text very literally, hyper-literally. And so if Shekhinah is a feminine gendered grammatical word, they say, no, it's not just grammar, folks. That's being. Because the Torah never makes any mistakes, ever. nothing is on accident. And so if the word is grammatically feminine, that means God must be feminine. Full stop. And so part of what makes Kabbalah so fascinating is not that it bends things around. And of course it does that too. It says how literal it takes things. And so we'll see that when we get into the Sefer Zohar. To tonight. Still be in the Proto-Kabbalah world tonight. But again, I think a lot of the stuff will still be Kabbalah, strictly speaking, as well.
This might be a difficult question, but
They all are.
the authors of these texts, any idea or any speculation on who they might be?
We have a lot of speculation. Sefer Yetzirah, Zahi Weiss has, I think, the best book about Sefer Yetzirah world, but also have their toe in the philosophical world, in the Christian Syriac world. We forget that that prior to the Islamic conquest, there was an enormous amount of translation of philosophical texts into Syriac by Christians in places like Syria, and that world was a booming philosophical world. And what ends up happening is that area is conquered by the armies of Islam, and then that the milieu in which that world existed is eclipsed, and those texts are rapidly translated into Arabic. And so Zahi Weiss argues, and I think convincingly, that if we look at some Samaritan literature and we look at some Syriac literature, there are texts that look a lot like the Sefer Yetzirah existing in those milieus. Does that tell us who? No. Does it maybe tell us when and where? Kind of. So someone with rabbinical knowledge, they're writing in very pure Mishnaic Hebrew, probably in contact with the rabbinical world, but also probably having their toe in the philosophical world and maybe in the mystical world, somewhere there. But the problem is that once Islam took over those areas in which the Umayyad Caliphate took over, the data gets really jarbled. Because we're talking about a period of maybe a couple hundred years, maybe 150 years. So that world existed and it was quickly eclipsed in the literary circle. The Sefer Bahir is just a mess. It could have originated in Europe. It could have originated in Mesopotamia. There are people, scholars, who are much better at this stuff than I am, much more articulate, much more learned. Convincing arguments have been made on both sides. Some people say it originated somewhere in Europe. I've argued it originated somewhere in Mesopotamia. I don't know. I've never seen an argument that's a slam dunk case. So the Bahir is just one of these texts where no one really knows exactly where it originated. The Bahir is much more closely in the rabbinical circuit. It reads a lot more like rabbinical literature. So it's so hard to say. You know, it's one of these things where, I think about poets, right? I think about poets. And, when I think about a poet like, I don't know, Arthur Rimbaud, right? I was given an example, someone that jumps to my mind, Arthur Rimbaud. Arthur Rimbaud was a poet who existed in poetic circles in France in the 19th century, but created a poetic language that no one could have saw coming. He basically gave birth to poetic symbolism as we know it, modern, in some sense, modern poetry. And if someone would have told me that was written somewhere else completely by someone, weird thing. And so it's so hard to know exactly where these texts emerged, how they developed, but the Sefer Bahir is profoundly mysterious. So I don't have it. I think you'd have to look at the literature and see the arguments, but I've never seen a convincing argument about someone claiming where it emerges. We do know where it took hold, and it took hold primarily in Europe. And so for many people, that's a good argument that it was written in Europe because that's where we see it flourish. Sefer Yetzirah is weird because it seems to flourish in 5 different places simultaneously, all through the world. So we see versions of it. We see commentaries being written in Italy at the same time they're being written in Iraq. At the same time they're being written in Egypt. And you're like, how the hell did this text get to these different places fast? And why Why did they write commentaries in the 10th century? What happened? Right? And the answer is we don't know. Scholarship is still working on this problem. It's profoundly serious because we know they weren't working together. It's not like the Sadia Gaon and Shabbatai and Danilo and Yehuda Barzilai over in Spain were all saying, hey, let's write commentaries on Sefer Yetzirah. They didn't even know they were doing it. And yet just... So, I don't know. It's something's going... There's a story there. And the truth of the matter is, we don't know. And also, by the way, Sefer Yetzirah is also composed in what is sometimes called the Jewish Dark Age. There was a period after the Talmud, but before the rise of the Midrash, where we have basically no documentation. There's a 300-year period in which nothing seems to have been written, right? And yet, Sefer Yetzirah was. So it's weird. It's super weird. It's a weird thing. Yeah, it's profound. Again, and sometimes I tell people, young scholars who want to get into this field, they're like, is there anything left to do? And I'm like, you have no idea. Basic things we don't know. And it's going to take people who read. It's going to take people who read Arabic. It's going to take people who read. And if we're going to be in these archives in countries like Iraq, in countries like Iran, because it's in those places, I think, where if there is a clue in Syria, if there is a clue to any of this, it's going to be in the state archives of those countries. And, lucky getting someone who can do all that work in those countries to do the work. The geopolitics subsumes this kind of literature. The questions before I jump into tonight. All right, folks. Let's talk a little bit about what Jewish mysticism looked like just before the rise of Kabbalah. Just a couple of social currents that are worth here. I don't have to tell y'all, right, that already by the time the Kabbalah appears, Jewish mysticism is already really complex. It's already intertwined. There are already several currents of it. Jewish mysticism wasn't one thing by the time Kabbalah appears. You have lots of currents. Sefer Yetzirah, Haftarah literature, Jewish magic. Jewish mysticism in a broad way was already very complex by the time Kabbalah appears. So, in many ways, it has a lot to work with. It has a huge repertoire of things that it can work with. Secondly, the Jewish world, once Kabbalah appears, had already spent centuries being racked by what is called the Maimonidean controversy. Now, Maimonidean controversy is incredibly complicated, but basically what we have is a debate about the merits of Maimonides. Remember this, and you may have forgotten it, or you may not even known. Maimonides is one of the most divisive figures in the history of Judaism. Now, I know that now, there's Maimonides High School, and Rambam this, and Rambam that, and everybody loves it. That was not the case in the Middle Ages. They were people that were very pro-Maimonides, and there were people that were very happy to give Maimonides' books to Dominicans to burn them. Jewish communities went to the Dominicans and said, hey, we heard you guys burn heretical literature. They're like, yeah, well, here's some. And they gave them Maimonides to burn. So, in a big way, Maimonides was an incredibly polarizing figure. Very polarizing. Because on the one hand, many people thought Maimonides rationalized every aspect about Judaism away. For them, Maimonides took Judaism and just made everything into metaphors. And Maimonides didn't bat an eye doing that. He would say, oh yeah, angels and demons, metaphors. God has a hand, it's a metaphor. Right? God has God is made of wind, ruach, it's a metaphor. Maimonides was happy to rationalize aspects of Judaism in a way that he did not feel conformed to his version of a kind of rationalizing Aristotelian worldview. Now, there are other Jews at the time who were like, hell no. If the text says they're angels, they're angels. You are not, Maimonides, you are not better than the Torah. You don't get to tell the Torah what the Torah means. If they're angels and demons, it's angels and demons. If the Chazal, if the Talmud says they're angels and demons, it's angels and demons. And too bad, Maimonides. You can be smart as who knows what. And you do not get to undo this. So the Maimonidean controversy tore through Europe. especially. And this was not a small matter. And we'll get into this maybe later on, but because many people were, I'll make a long story short, if you really think that a lot of this stuff is metaphors, angels and demons and the law and all kinds of separate metaphors, and if God is really just an unmoved mover in the center of all the void of space, making everything mechanically move around, do you really care if you pray at a church or a synagogue? You might not care. And so when they tell you, right, if you're a wealthy doctor, wealthy lawyer, court physician, wealthy poet, musician, and some guy comes along and says, you got to convert or leave, do you leave your fancy job? Or do you go, it's all about the same? Well, that happened. And many Jews felt that Maimonides led other Jews into conversion. He assimilated them, right? And again, think about all the things we've talked about in the 20th century about how many people love to hate on assimilation. Well, this formed a reaction in the Spanish Jewish world, especially the French Jewish world, where Maimonides really got, people really polarized the world, as Maimonides said. Well, one reaction to rigorous rational philosophy is a kind of romanticism. And we know that because we've seen it happen over and over and over again in history of philosophy, right? Gave way, right? The Kant, Descartes, the hyper-rationalism of people like Leibniz gave way to the romanticism of people like Goethe, right? And Schelling, and the 19th century German phenomenon, 19th century German situation. You can't imagine the Baroque ideas of Hegel as anything other than a response to the hardcore rationalism in a certain kind of way of Kant. So romanticism is always a reaction to rationalism in some way, and we see it actually play itself out here in the 13th century. Also important is Jews at the time in Spain are living under the administration, at this time, are living under the administration of Alfonso X. Now, Alfonso X is one of these guys you probably haven't heard of, but it's actually really, really important in the history of a lot of things. Because Alfonso X was probably one of the most tolerant and curious monarchs in European history. He allowed for and encouraged translation between Arabic, Hebrew, and Latin. He was probably one of the most benign, enlightened despot. In fact, if you want to think of an enlightened despot par excellence, it was Alfonso X. He was called Alfonso the Wise. And again, when you get these epithets right, like when you're Philip the Fair, or Philip the Bald, or Radu the Ugly, these typically are kind of accurate. And Alfonso the Wise was a pretty wise dude. And it's in his administration that Jews were probably allowed the greatest amount of civil freedom until Napoleon. So if you want to think about it in those terms, right, Alfonso X probably allowed Jews in his realm than any other European leader until Napoleon. And so Alfonso the Wise set up a relatively liberal, again, within the confines of medieval Christendom and all the things that go into that, but a relatively liberal world in which new ideas can be published, Jews travel, they can do things like that. Also, what's important to note about this at the same time is that Jews and Christians are living at an unusually close proximity, especially in Spain and Girona, and they're talking at a level that they really hadn't prior, and they really don't ever after. And they're influencing each other. Two things are really worth mentioning here. One is the Cathar cult, right? The Cathar heresy, right? Say heresy, whatever. Led dualistic movement of Christendom that lived at the very margins of Catholicism and maybe inside of it, and they were were not Christians against Muslims; they were Christians against other Christians. The Albigensians was a crusade against, in many ways, Christians, Albigensian Christians, Catholic Christians. And also what's important to note about this time period is this is the time period of the rise of the Marian cult. And I say Marian cult, just know that I'm going to be using in a religious studies term. I mean the word cult in a negative way. I just mean as an intense religious movement. Say there was an intense spike in Spain at this time around the image and theology of Mary and Mary adoration became intense at this time period in around the 13th, early 30s, around Mary. There was a lot of intense veneration of Mary at this time, because that's going to be a marketing point for the Jews, because Mary is very charismatic. People really like Mary. Catholic Church, they're about that, right? Marian intercession, Mary veneration proved to be enormously popular with rank and file people. Well, man, if the Catholic thing, what are the Jews going to get? You know the answer. Shekhinah. Right? In many ways, the Shekhinah, the feminine aspect of God, is the Jewish response to the rise in the Marian veneration. Anything you can do, we can do better. You got the Mother of God, we got the feminine God. Right? This is a kind of theological one upmanship maybe we'll see, and the development of Kabbalah. But there on the left, you can see Alfonso X. I actually have a coin. I collect medieval coins because I have to have every conceivable dorky hobby that one can have. And I actually have a silver dinar of Alfonso X. You can even see in his minting that he's really picky about his minting. His minting is especially beautiful in a way that previous and after their minting, Spanish minting is notoriously bad. But Alfonso X really wanted to have beautiful coins minted, and you can see that in his mints. He's an eye to detail. All right. So, what are the kind of core philosophical problems that are going to intervene in the rise of Kabbalah? Because one of the things I always like to point out to people is that mysticism and rationalism are never really opposed in history until now. It's only in the aftermath of the 18th century that we really oppose the mystical and the rational. You don't see that in the Middle Ages. You don't see it in the late classical period. It's a really modern thing in many ways. What we get right is an attempt to solve ethical problems. And when we say philosophical, what we really might say is theosophical. They're philosophical problems that heavily overlap with so it's not quite philosophy, it's not quite theology, it's something in between. Because there was already developed Jewish theology, and there was already developed Jewish philosophy, Maimonides, Saadia Gaon, right? There was the traditional visions of God that had been inherited from the Talmud. Well, this isn't either one of them. This is something in between, sort of a cutting-edge kind of thing. So the question became this. This is basically a Neoplatonic question for folks who know a bit about the history of philosophy. And I say it's a Neoplatonic question because Neoplatonism is now moving into Europe via the Islamic context for the first time. And that question is this. It's a pretty basic question that is fully unanswerable. We have an infinite God. Because no one wants a finite God, right? You don't want a God who doesn't know stuff. You ask God, hey, what's the derivative of this? God's like, You don't want a God who doesn't know calculus. You want a completely transcendent God that is all-knowing, all-powerful, all-wise, all-good, all the things. Right? You want this God. Everybody wants that transcendent God. And yet, I don't know everything about you, right? I don't have a lot. I don't know everything about most things. 99.999 things I don't know everything about. I don't know anything about anything, probably. This is a basic philosophical problem. How do you bridge the gap? Because let's do some basic math. Infinity minus 1 is still infinity. Infinity minus 10 million is still infinity. Infinity minus 12 billion, 11 billion, whatever. You can't subtract enough, right? You think about trying to pull this, you never get to it. And if you try to get, how do you bridge the gap? Neoplatonism is infamous for trying this problem by adding what they call hypostases. Hypostases is just a common word for things that are in between. They're things that are in the things that go from really complicated, right? Right. So this is the most simple one here on the far left. This is the system of Plotinus, the very famous Greek Roman philosopher from the 3rd century. And then by the time we get to the morphic philosophies, right, this very small image, you can see how very complicated this has gotten. Now, right, these are just intermediaries between us and God, between the one and the sense world. Now, if you look at this image, right, or this image and this image, I bet you can already see where we're going. If you've ever seen an image of the Sephirot, the tree of life, right? You see how these look the same? They're starting to look similar. It's because Kabbalists are going to solve the problem in a really similar way. All right? Again, we have to end this weird modern idea that mysticism and rationality, mysticism and philosophy can't play together. They've always played together until recently. And this is a great example where they've really played together. Now, Kabbalah wants to, like I say, have its cake and eat it too. They want to maintain that God is, in fact, infinitely transcendent. They want to maintain that. And they want to maintain God is immanent. God of the Hebrew Bible that walks around in the cool of the evening in our Eden. They want to maintain God's radical transcendence and God's radical immanence. They want to have both. Because they have to have both. Because if God showed up to some guy and gave him a bunch of rules, God is immanent to this world. And also, if God is responsible for being, God must transcend being, because being can't come from being must come from something else. And so God must also be beyond being. And how Kabbalah is going to solve this is by introducing three concepts that anyone here who's studied any Kabbalah already has heard of. But you may not know why they're there, right? If they're there because they solve these three philosophical problems. Now, solve them is a strong word, but in the mind of the Kabbalists, they solve them.
Here he has the side of the puts it on the bread. Looks it, goes the tire. Oil of flaming up down. As the Gemara also, even the same last. Okay, so each one we're going to come up with an extreme. That you're right, it always says Torah, but it's not. It's who goes market or what's his market, but it's not. Obviously, I see it. I have a feeling it's not. That's in the right way. It's something important. So let's go right, left instead of left, right. Johnny also gives the six. Hey, yeah, so not the single book of the it says the puzzle. That's it. So it says the truth. So they're going to refer to this to the yellow Torah. The Torah. When a person has something special, you got out of jail, whatever it is, it's a green. These bread. Now, you get these bread, and you're getting one pile of these types of bread. Well, over, you can't forget any of them. If you want a Torah, it doesn't take you good. Over just one word, it's not our fault. Actually, bread, they're all knocking. Now, because of it, that's the reason. You're right, typically, Torah is enough. But you want to. The point that is still is another, the sin of death, and some of them, but we're not sure what we're having. Not just okay, very the Torah. Person who has to die will see me as a Torah. It only says word verse. But not. Our goal is just the Torah people there. So our fourth thing in the Torah, Amos Aaron, Amos, Nikolai, Spark. Now we never knew what it was, but people look at this. You know something random for today? Here's the guy with Torah, he's out of the pocket with a little hut somewhere. So by the way, sometimes we catch this bird. Some of them are going to try very hard when they're kids. If you live in a house, if you live in your room and you cannot catch them, sometimes you catch them. You have to take the bird, rinse the azole, and spread the material. Now, I have more than a little learning. Got one bird fly away, the bird has what do they call it? Name everything, including his eyebrows. Something else to see. Oh, so the four max, let's say you don't have any of you can spray the guy. Then the other thing is, so the word Kia is very, very strong. Sorry, you're not assuming it's very similar to the word Kuka, it's very, very strong. It's just fire on your hand, but you can see it before. See the fire. Very before so it's the now it's just one more list of things that before we talk about fire and now we're talking about Kuka. Whatever it says, the word Kuka is not, it's not even a word back and it says, We know that on your kicker here, we have the two goats, one you throw off a cliff and one you chef. You don't have to do it. You can't do either one. Hello, finally, one. Oh, you call your own blood. You don't need both. You don't both together. You're right. So after everything, it comes down to one or the other. Oh, you're own or both. You start thinking about it further than enough market, right? I got like the Equilibrium of all words. That can tell me that the word where by itself is not different. It's more on the word fire alone is not magic. That's why you need a second word. The word is strong enough by itself. Now, when we had that Gemara, so we had text on plan. Gemara over there says, so it's text about being in, then why do you need the word fight? Fight by itself doesn't mean right. So it comes somewhere as a question of spot, and it doesn't really bring an answer. So the fire also is short rough. You're right. And the word fire is going to come from a certain rough, which doesn't help with it. Yeah. But fire of the Puzagov, Rab says it's close. Fire of the Puzagov is not what he meant to. But that was just fire. Even if the fire says the word fire, people move it in. But you must have a second word for Puka. The key word is Puka. If it says Puka, then it means not. It doesn't make Puka out of difference if it's fire or not. It's not right. So that's what I carve it and says the word fire. Where is this? Now the problem is that the whole argument doesn't say the word Puka. Every single one of those steps is just one step. Throw it out. So then why does it have to repeat itself twice? Like minimum. It's enough to say Puka. You must do it. You don't have to repeat twice. Or if you want to do that, everybody will better than that. Because there is like the life. And you also see the Puka after. You already come up with an excuse. No, you're right. Just Puka by looking at that, but it's the eating part, not the avoided part. It doesn't refer to the giant list of 4 eating. Very little on the hotel, so let's get out there. Very little about but also the work is only by the eating part. Now we know it's not sit down how to do that. You need to have one ball bread. You only have two bread, like a bun is not any so the two hungry is there, and the two schools of the money road that have the screen. If you have one, it's not good. As long as I'm thinking of the death, you have to get one bread, you don't have any money. You have to just put your money in that bread. You're not doing anything. And the word Puka is made the in part, not on the other part. Hello, no point in thinking about it. No, but this Puka, I don't care where it's at. Even by the part, taking the part out of it. But for people, it's over girl, you're so the flour and the oil. So such Rashi over here, very important Rashi of the about them. Why do the players to tell us that you miss a little piece of the shemen or the flour is no good. But the problem is, because you got, then I don't need a special purist shemen. It has to be exactly as is. Because the first is sorry. If you're missing one grain of flour, I don't even get the flour.
First is the concept of Ein Sof. This is the infinite hidden God. This is the God beyond all being. Ein Sof just means the infinite, right? Right? It's just the God beyond all being. This is the God that is transcendent, that is unknowable, that is beyond everything that you could ever imagine, and is beyond all linguistic predication. But you can't end there. God has to get to here. How does God get to here? God emanates out of that vast, infinite, beyond being, that vast nothingness, no thingness, right? God is no thing. God has to begin to enumerate. God has to begin to emanate out of God's self. And how does God emanate out of God's self? Well, God emanates out of God's self in 10 Sephirot. And those Sephirot are the emanations cascading out of the Godhead, out of the infinite nothingness of the Godhead, something. And bit by bit, a ladder is built, reaching down into being. And the very last rung of that ladder is God's presence. Shekhinah, feminine aspect of God, right? God pours out God's presence. And as God pours out God's presence, that in the shelter of that presence, right, is the imminent reality of God in this world. And in some sense, is this world. That's that final mountain, this world. So the solution to this problem, the gap between the infinite and the finite, this Neoplatonic problem, Kabbalah is a very, 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 very complicated way of solving that problem using these three philosophical devices. Ein Sof, Sphira, Shekhinah. Now we're going to greatly complicate that story as we get into this, right? But my argument is that if you want to roll it down to a basic problem, to that basic problem, the gap between the finite and the infinite, and the basic solution are these three things. Now, when I say basic, not basic at all, and also when we get into Kabbalah, as we'll see, it gets much more complicated, right? So it gets much more complicated. Let's talk about some of the early groups of Kabbalists at this time. The earliest one we can talk about, right? We may need to stretch this lecture until next time. That may have to happen. We're actually kind of going kind of slowly. We'll make what time we have, and we'll have to pick up next time where we leave off. We'll pick up what we like. Pick up next time. The earliest school of Kabbalah that we can recognize as such is what we would call the Hebrew circle, the speculation circle. This circle, folks, existed somewhere either in southern Spain, although more recent scholarship puts them, or more southern France, although more recent scholarship puts them in Spain. And this group of folks seem to have been a very small group of rabbinical elites focusing on these kinds of problems. For them, they also posit the idea that there's some kind of ladder gapping the infinite and the finite. And for them, however, that ladder is actually 13 separate. And what they do is they say that there are 10 separate, but the 10th separate contains 3 additional separate. Right? So they think that there are 13. Now, you might be asking, why 13? Well, because they're trying to solve another problem, and that other problem is that there seem to be 13 attributes of the mercy of God in the rabbinical literature, and they think that it's much more logical for there to be 13 attributes of God rather than 10, so they kind of roll the last 3 into the final one. It's kind of nested in there. Now, that idea of nesting emanations within emanations, right? That's going to go absolutely bonkers in a couple hundred years. When you have nested Sephiroth inside nested Sephiroth inside nested Sephiroth, it's going to go out of control. Their metaphorical language really makes the Yun circle really important, is that a lot of their symbolic language, like the language of lights, flames, lights and fragrances, right? That when you smell a beautiful rose, right, it doesn't take anything away from the rose. Now, strictly speaking, I guess it does, but they know that, right? But the idea is that when you smell in the rose still stays the same, even though you get the fragrance. And so in some ways, you can think about that the rose emitting fragrance is an image for the emanations of God in the world. In fact, this idea survived. If you've ever read the 13-petal rose, the idea that the fragrance is given off by the flower that is God, which, by the way, is a feminine symbol, right? Flower and the vulva are always connected together in medieval poetry, already beginning to get this sort of clearing aspect of the nature of the Godhead, where God is feminine and male at the same time, both an active force, right, but also a passive force, that humans are the ones smelling God's giving off the odor. So again, you get this idea where this gender-bending stuff is already beginning to happen. The image of the overflowing fountain, it's very clear that they're actually looking at medieval fountains and imagining these cascading fountains in the Middle Ages in Spain as kind of like what God is like. So you can actually look at these medieval fountains. Which I've actually gone to Spain and seen some of these medieval fountains in Castile, and they're still there from this time period. And you're like, oh wow, that's what they were seeing when they thought of the Sephiroth, right? And sometimes they imagine the sun going down, and they can see the sun coming through the light of the water, and that image to them is very powerful of how the universe, how the cosmos functions. They're also very keenly interested in the sacred Yetzirah. They do write some commentaries involving the creation of the golem, and they're very interested philosophically in how creation began and it persists. About 32 very brief works of the Iyun circle, the earliest circle of Kabbalists there, probably in Spain, survive. Although some of their works are only a page long. The most famous work they produced was called a text called the Fountain of Wisdom, and the Fountain of Wisdom goes on to be reprinted and reprinted and reprinted well beyond the survival of the Iyun circle. There's a book, I'll give a reference at the end. If you want to read basically the major works that have come down to us from the Iyun circle, I'll give you a book that you can check out if you want to read some of their works. Many of them have been translated, some of them have been translated. The other major group here is going to be the Provence Circle, and specifically the Provence Circle being led by Isaac the Blind, who is also referred to as Saki Nahor, which in Aramaic means the one who is full of light. The idea is that while Saki Nahor couldn't see from birth, he could see from his eyes, but he could see with his soul, and the fact that he was blind was not a disability, that he had an ability. Because Saki Nahor wasn't deluded like the rest of us, Saki Nahor could see the inner structure of reality, whereas we just see a bunch of illusions. And so the idea that Saki Nahor was not blind, he was full of light. So I always like to refer to him as Saki Nahor rather than Isaac the Blind, rather focused on his ability than him.
That's Rabbi Rothschild.
At any rate, Saki Nahor thrived in the late part of the 12th century, and he is, so far as we can tell, the first full-time Kabbalist. He wasn't an adjunct Kabbalist. He was a full-time Kabbalist. He was a Kabbalist in tenure track. And we can thank him for fixing the amount of the Sephiroth. He fixes it to 10. After Saki Nahor fixes the number of Sephiroth to 10, he uses a verse in the Hebrew Bible from 1 Chronicles 29:11 to fix the number of Sephiroth to 10. It never changes after that. Never. Saki Nahor basically sets the stage for Kabbalah, at least in terms of eliminating the amount of Sephiroth that there are. And what he argues is that the Sphirot actually existed prior to our world. They're a bridge to our world. So God exists in God's utter transcendent state. The Sephiroth are a kind of intermundia. They're a world between worlds. And our world is what is connected by the ladder of the Sephiroth to the world of the transcendent. So, and this will be a debate, by the way, a lot in Kabbalah, is to what degree do the Sephiroth exist in our world or beyond our world, or are they a part of our world? Do they transcend our world? In which world do they exist? Do they exist before or after creation, right? When God said yes, or does that inaugurate the development of the Sephiroth, or do they exist prior to that? Sagi Nahor actually argues in a really dramatic and really ingenious, there's no other word for it. What he does is to prove this, that the Sephiroth existed prior to our world. Sagi Nahor actually goes to the Hebrew Bible, to the book of Genesis, and he describes how the very first chapters of Genesis, the creation story, do not describe the creation of our world. For Sagi Nahor, the Genesis creation story, let there be light, and there was light, and there was lights, and there was a firmament, and all this stuff. For him, that's not our world. That's the world before our world. So the Genesis creation story, the first Genesis creation story, describes the world. In fact, the second one too describes the generation of the post-divine world, the world after God is literally transcendent, but before our world comes into existence. Now, we're very lucky because our world mirrors that world. And therefore, the Genesis story does double duty. Read on one level, it's the story of how our world came into existence. But read on a deeper level, on a more transcendent level, it's the story of how the supernal world, the world of the Sephiroth, came into existence. And so if you know how to read it correctly, according to Sagi Nahor, in this very esoteric way, you can read into the Genesis story the preternatural coming into being of the world. And his commentary is, to my mind, the first commentary to do exactly that. Now, the Sefer Zohar, which we'll get to beginning next week, spends hundreds of pages on that. So again, Sagi Nahor sets the stage for what's going to become the huge unfolding of the world of the Zohar and the world of the Kabbalah proper. Now, as you might imagine, Sagi Nahor also prohibited teaching these ideas to the public. He prohibited writing them down. He had a famous quote that he sent to some of his students over in Castile, where he said, and the blinds in Provence, he said, look, if you, he said, a book concealed in a cupboard isn't. If you lock a book in a cupboard, it's not concealed. It's going to get out, right? And so he says, write this stuff down, right? He says, a candle concealed in a cupboard isn't concealed. Why? There's no light shining in it. If you try to conceal a candle in a cupboard, you think someone's going to see it. Well, if you try to conceal this stuff in books, it's not going to work. Why? People are going to find the books. People are going to publish the books. They're going to copy them. And so he's the first person to actively forbid the writing down of Kabbalistic ideas. And it was for a very brief time successful. Let me focus on the phrase very brief. Right? Very brief. Because as soon as it gets over the border to Spain and Girona, the brothers, the Kabbalists over in Girona, immediately began disseminating this material. And what ended up happening is they further disseminated it, and they further write it down, and they began to disseminate it. You can see here, this is an image of the Girona synagogue, which is still there in Girona. I've been there. It's very weird to walk around in the old Jewish sections of Girona, knowing that Kabbalah was basically birthed there. It feels like the walls are Kabbalah at some level, and trauma, considering how many Jews were evicted from those areas. Rabbi Azrael, one of the Sagi Nahor's students, systematizes the Sephirot for the first time. And not only does he systematize the Sephirot, he systematizes the very earliest doctrines about the Sephirot into what is basically a Kabbalistic catechism. When I say catechism, I mean catechism. Question, answer, question, answer, question, answer, catechism. Again, Catholics and Jews, they kind of talk to each other. Catholics, about that catechism life, well, right, many Jews look to scholastic literature with its question and answer structure, and they copy it. And Rabbi Azrael is one of the first to really systematize, for the first time, Kabbalah, and in many ways produces the first systematic account of how Ein Sof gives rise to the Sephirot, how the Sephirot gives rise to our world. So it's something like an early Kabbalistic catechism. It's a really fantastic little text. Also, one of Rabbi Azrael's students is Nachmanides, who you probably know as the Ramban. Right? Ramban. Nachmanides is one of the most famous Bible commentators in the entire Middle Ages, and he's famous for pointing out mystical parts of the Hebrew Bible in his commentaries. Now, his commentary itself isn't overtly mystical, but he always says, right, you know. He always points to these very clear instances, right, where there's a Kabbalistic thing happening. Here's a thing, here's a thing. There are these signposts in his commentaries telling, right, that there's a Kabbalistic thing that's a secret here. And in many ways, Nachmanides' commentary is very mystically imbued commentary on the Hebrew Bible, goes to great lengths to making the Kabbalah more mainstream. And we're going to see this to be an issue, right? Kabbalah has always had a PR problem. It's always been the case that it's been very alluring, but rabbis have always been pretty skeptical of it for many years. In Nachmanides, one of the main things he does is he legitimates a lot of Kabbalistic ideas by including them in what was taken to be one of the most definitive Bible commentaries ever written. So sometimes you don't have to innovate a thing, sometimes you can just legitimate a thing. And by including it, by legitimating it, by the way, we've already seen that happen with Sefer Yetzirah, right? Sefer Yetzirah basically became part of the Jewish canon because very famous Jews like Barzillai, Shabbatai Golo, and the Sadia Gaon all wrote commentaries on it. Well, if they wrote commentaries on it, it must be good. It must be true. Well, ditto, if Nachmanides has written, right, if you understand this, right, al pri derech, right, if you understand this, right, al pri derech emet, according to the way of truth, then it must be some Kabbalistic thing that must be important. Also, Jacob Shushan is important here as well. He's basically a moralizer, right? He writes very moralizing treaties, and those moralizing treaties go a great way of developing a Kabbalistic moral system, which we'll get into. And also, he leads an attack on how Moses Maimonides interprets the throne of God. This is very important, right? Because one of the things that Kabbalists want to do is maintain earlier forms of mysticism, like American mysticism. Remember, it ultimately results with one being able to witness the throne of God. And part of what Yaakov Sheshe wants to do is maintain a very traditional, mystical understanding of the throne of God, as opposed to Maimonides' very metaphorical and symbolic, non-literal, maybe more rational. Last one, folks, as we start to wrap up for this evening. We're now moving over to Castile, right, into northern central Spain. And again, the drama of the Kabbalah is playing itself out in southern France and Spain, over here now to Castile. The Castile circle really focused in on two brothers, the Cohen brothers, which I know you're now thinking the Cohen brothers, like they made movies. No, the Cohen brothers in Castile, and they both claim to have found hidden lost books. Now, these hidden lost books they claim to have found, typically we look at those claims in history with a lot of skepticism. But they might have been lying. Scholars think that they may have had access to some relatively unusual books from maybe late antiquity, maybe a little later, but there's reason to believe that some of the things they were looking at weren't completely made up out of their head. And what we get in Rabbi Jacob is a very interesting interpretation, a very esoteric interpretation of the Hebrew letters. That idea of an esoteric interpretation of the Hebrew letters we've already seen in the Sefer Bahir. We get another version of it here in Rabbi Jacob. And in Rabbi Isaac, we get perhaps one of the most shocking books, I think the most top 3 shocking books ever written in Judaism. This is a book called The Treatise of the Emanation of the Left-Hand Side. And what Rabbi Isaac argues is that flowing down the left-hand side of the emanation structure of the divine is evil. That evil is a quintessential aspect of the development of God, that the Sephirot have an inherently evil concept that could not have been, right? Now, this is very important, because traditionally in Judaism and in Christianity and in Islam, evil has typically been imagined to be a privation. Just like cold is the privation of heat, or darkness is the privation of light, many theologians argue that darkness and evil doesn't exist on its own. The Cohen brothers, specifically in this tractate on the treatise on the emanation left-hand side, argues, no, evil is part and parcel of the structure of reality. It could not have been otherwise. And further, God did try to constrain it, and it didn't work. God tried to constrain it 3 different times. Every time it reared back into horrifying reality. And the 3rd time, what ends up happening is there's an entire alternate Sephirot system on the back side of the Sephirot system that's evil. So imagine the divine system, right, with like all the little, the dots of the Sephirot. Well, imagine they have an inverse version. That inverse version is evil, right? Now the first 3 are destroyed. God destroys them, but the rest remain. And the last 3, the last 7 that remain are demonic forces that still halt our reality. And those demonic forces are part and parcel of the necessary structure of reality. So this is where evil is actually primordial. Evil existed before creation itself, and it will be here until creation is destroyed. This idea, right, the idea that evil is primeval, seems to have really been influential in the development of early Kabbalah, and the idea that evil is fundamental to reality is going to go directly into the Zohar. So what's going to end up happening is this evil is going to be here basically until the Messiah comes, and this world is completely transformed, purged of that evil. So insofar as there is a reality, that reality is penetrated, inherently, logically penetrated. Now, the idea, right, is that we can resist that evil by doing the mitzvah. This idea coming from the tree examination left hand side says when you do the law of God, when you follow the Torah, you're not just following the rules of God. What you're actually doing is metaphysical warfare against evil. So when you observe Sabbath, when you lay tefillin, when you give money to the poor, you're not just doing a mitzvah. You're engaged in a titanic battle of good versus evil, where the goodness pushes back against the demonic forces of evil. And by pushing back the demonic forces of evil, it creates a kind of gap, and into that gap, Messiah will come. And so the idea is that you have to do this. And the Talmud's also pretty clear about this. Messiah only comes in two circumstances: when a generation deserves it because of their righteous deeds, or when the world is so evil that only the Messiah can fix it. And so the idea here is you must do the work of creating a gap through righteousness in the forces of evil so that Messiah can come through and wipe it all out. So the treaties on the emanation on the left-hand side, and we're going to see this when we get into the Zohar next week, is decisively important in the development of the Kabbalistic conception of evil, which is not anything like Maimonides. It's nothing like St. Augustine. It's nothing like the proponents of Al-Ashari in the Masonic tradition. This is a rigorous idea that evil is real, it's part of reality, and it must be actively resisted. Again, look at some Christian theologians in the Middle Ages and see also their focus on evil. Right? You can even see the art in the Middle Ages, right? Where, have you ever seen the art of the crucifixion, right? You can see that around the time of the early Middle Ages, Jesus is hanging on the cross looking very serene. But by the High Middle Ages, he's bloated, green, he's dangling almost in a Y shape, his body is frail and broken. Evil becomes a huge conception in the 13th century in Spain. We can see those ideas beginning to leak into the Jewish sphere with the treatise of the animation on the left-hand side. It's in this circumstance, folks, as we start to wrap up this evening, I'll take some questions. I'm sorry, went a little bit longer than normal. It's in this circumstance that we meet Moshe de Leon, right? In Castile, in the middle of the 13th century. And it is around Moshe de Leon that a book called the Sefer Zohar was composed. And if you know anything about Zohar, anything about Kabbalah, this is the central text of Jewish mysticism, the Sefer Zohar. And I will say, in many ways, it's the last text to gain universal recognition by all of the world's Jews as scripture. I'll say that once more before we end for tonight. The Sefer Zohar, the book of the Zohar, is the last text to gain universal recognition from Jews in Yemen, Jews in Spain, Jews in Northern Europe, Jews in North Africa, Jews in North America and South America, Jews in the Caribbean. All of world Jewry came to accept the authority of the Sefer Zohar, and it is the last Jewish scripture to become a Jewish scripture in the US. The only Jews who really rejected it were 19th century Reformers. They rejected it. Right? So they decanonized it. Prior to that, there was no Jewish group, no Jewish community that didn't think at some level the Sefer Zohar was a piece of scripture. I argue we got to reclaim it as scripture. Liberal Jews, right? We got to reclaim it because I think it's one of the most amazing documents ever written in the history of spirituality. It's an amazing document. We should reclaim it, and we should reclaim it because of what it does with the gender. We should reclaim it because of what it does with language. It's a postmodern text in many ways. We should do it for what it does to all the amazing things it's acknowledged. We should reclaim it because it's ours. And it should not be the unique purview of the Haredi world to claim that it's theirs. I think it's so harsh to claim it's part of our scriptures too. And so we'll get to it starting next time. Just some text here on early Kabbalah if you're interested. The Joseph Dawn book, early Kabbalah, I will say is pound for pound single best book of Kabbalah, early Kabbalah you can get. The early Kabbalah, yeah, it's pretty aptly titled. He covers a lot of the stuff. The treatise on the emanation, the treatise on the emanation left hand side is also in the early Kabbalah. Also, there's a really great book he has on the Meet Cherub Circle, the guys that invented Ha'atzalah, emanation. He has a whole book on them, really fascinating. You'll need to ILL that one, it's a little expensive. If you want to read about the Union Circle, the earliest group of Kabbalists, Vernon has a really great book on them. The entire text of the Sefer Bahir is reproduced by Kaplan, although I will say that my caveat with Kaplan is that Kaplan is a practicing Lurianic Kabbalist. We'll get to Lurianic Kabbalah in a few weeks. And he kind of reads back into literature like Sefer Yetzirah and Sefer Bahir, later Lurianic conceptions that distort them a little bit, but still a good text and still a good translation nonetheless. And so I reproduced the Cherub Circle down there with Joseph Dawn. All right, next week, folks, we get to the big one. We're going to spend an entire session on the Sefer Zohar. I could do an entire class on the Sefer Zohar. And easily do an entire class. I could spend the rest of my life studying the Sefer Zohar. But we're going to spend an entire class on it. I'm doing my very best to get you oriented to it so that you can feel confident, at least beginning to get into some of the sections. Because it is an intimidating text. And I'll admit, it's the single most intimidating text I know of. Like Hegel, Fisher-Price, compared to the Sefer Zohar. Right? Like, just, phenomenology of spirit, it's like training. So that's it, folks. Sefer Zohar next week. Welcome back, and thank you for joining me as I explore the garden that is Jewish mysticism and Kabbalah. Again, if you'd like to support my work of providing accessible, free, and scholarly content on topics like Kabbalah, alchemy, and the occult, along with magic and hermetic philosophy, consider supporting my work on Patreon, or perhaps with a one-time donation. You can find those links below. Until next time, I'm Dr. Justin Sledge, and thank you for watching Esoterica, where we explore the arcane in history, philosophy, and religion.
So, just as I'm not exactly sure what I'm saying, but let's just say, for argument's sake, later on, and then look it up. And it's traveling, so we're talking about it, like, who wants to know? It's like a lot, so you fold it in half, and then you fold it again. Let's just say that's an expression. And then you open it up, you have these lines on it, and you put it on the line, so like this, like that, on the line. So let's say this is the 4 pieces, or whatever. So this is the side. He went, and he always did, food. So it's like this side. Instead of splitting it, put it together. That is like the job. So one shot is rebar, you can smaller. Now instead of 4 pieces, you have to cut it in half. Whatever, 8, 16, whatever, let me say that. Just 2 minutes. Why you say whatever, you move it now? No, I think you very much. What's the problem? He said, you don't do it at all, it's okay. So you made large things with the problem. I was saying, I'm also doing it because it's not. You don't do it at all. So you have to do it. The power of Brazil. So let me know if there's conflict, though. You can't come home and say right home. Or shopping, like, 3 pieces. It's not a house. It's not, it's only for his house, it's one for his dinner. You manage to wrap together again. So this was a halacha of bringing the certain size part. They don't have a large towel, you have a global towel. So I think that it's not good to say, even stay out, like, well, clean it out, you go. The master law. Anyways, this is like your Shimon. This sign here of Shimon Oimer. Oh, it's beautiful. What is that? Maybe our Mishnah doesn't look like your Shimon. Very close. So, Koyan is one of the Shimon. So, Koyan chain, this sign here of Shimon Oimer. So, Koyan chain, what is about? What is the same the same? But the Koyan doesn't agree with it. The Koyan chain says that a Koyan is used. That way, what is it? Shenema. You don't get a name of the you doesn't get a part of the group. It's interesting. It seems like Sloan said, let's say this is I don't really think it's a then he would get a quote. I was you can't say, oh, I want a part of this miracle. You don't even believe in something that he's supposed to do that he's already. Shenema, the microphone is much longer. The subtitle, they heard, you always see it show you he should get it. We're going to get down the program. What is the Bible? Is the Bible? What the Bible? You're prepared, you have to do. Maybe I'm going to go about you go over here, though. What about what you saw the the 9, the rabbis, the other. I don't know, what are they? So, number 1, what was the rest of it? How you feel like pouring the oil, the same promise. It's like, we'll put over here. It's like, my home, don't buy egg. Oh, yeah. How do you throw it? It said that he throws it to do it. So now we're showing you that meaning that he throws it into the exposure. Over here it says it's going to hold it in place. Now we're going to do the rest of the time. Family like mixing the meat. Back pieces, cutting them into pieces. Back the deep place and putting the same on. Back the points and waving in a different direction. Open pocket food. And I don't know what else do we our Robert's going to do that. Cardona is right. Shalom. But I've also the whole things that I did before. That was back two choices of the network. Back carrots, and we're putting the food on the network. Not the Nico's doing the Nico of a bird. He says, no, and it's not proper. Painful food, whatever. Back the bullets and receiving the blood, and then sprinkling the blood on the bash, so he goes. And he doesn't believe it. It's water for women because it's still out of the Barita said, well, and chopping off, they go out of the person, the person sitting before I have to put it up and making the whole practice, they put it on the blood on his finger, on his thumb, and the ears open. When it sees the high and beautiful, when it sees the high and pain, there's a clear nation of books, whether it's in the Hazara or the Shul, and what if he does in the 3:30 in one of these 15? So I'm going to go by the day out. I'm going to go the day out. All the things that are due time in the 15. But that's the way to go. If you don't put the one, thing is going to don't get it. Only for a client, not for you. Or not for the cash. It's not a consideration by you. You only refer to what you do. It's not the difference for having, but it's a little of a client cutting a bus. I don't know what's short. I was just talking about everybody saw better from the time. Everybody saw the bad. You know that the first worker was the rest of the prayer. So what is this? Breaking the children. Okay. Look at this part. The videos they are because having a job starting from the house, so everything was short easy. The whole way so pouring the soil, that oil, adding the clouds, that instructed so much. Then I told us this is yeah, we just go we're like clearing the oil, heating it to charity. I don't know, that's what it is. Oh, when it comes to the ritual of the fire where there is no pizza, because the rest of the others there. So this whole country is going to fight with the fire. So then, why do you think we're not bad fire? Before everybody proves all things fire and not in this world, that's what we're going to do. Oh, they're over here doing this down there, the shot is doing something. I don't even know what they're going to fire. How do you know they'd be up for oil for the first time? Maybe probably, except for the regular of the big show. How often charities are? I'm not sure. So just like the straw, because good by Israel, so you were the finance. Because should be good by Israel. Regarding of not in some place, it's slightly different. We're not companies love this function. We're not making a difference between Israel, football, and it's not football, rather talking about when It's the smallest. It's considered like the smallest fruit, vegetable item, food item. So we're talking about pickle. What's pickle? A person being a person that is broke and pick himself that I'm gonna take. As he eats so as he puts it on the steya, he says himself, I am going to eat the shirayim. I'm gonna eat the leftover, whether it's leftover dough or the leftover flour. I'm gonna eat this flour, the leftover tomorrow. Now we don't think we don't eat today. A little what you're watching, it's like an oil, like a pasta, you don't eat it today. So he thinks about tomorrow, it's already outside the minute time. So that's big on, and if you ate it right now, today, yes, butter. Why don't you already have that thought you can eat tomorrow? Now what happens if you break it down, the nuclear atomic part of it, every single function, every sesame seed, you can figure out. One big old thing, and then that's looking for the whole pizza with 1,000 sesame seeds. So it's 1,000 times, one sesame seed at a time. All the pickles of the sesame seeds were combined to be one pickle. If the triple level sugar, just call it butter sugar, food fish, and entire treats, 1,000 of them. I'm thinking about another appreciation that I'm really important. Food on pizza is what? I don't know, people. It works. It's simple. And look like the snakes you're seeing was put in the small one. Those are right on the top of the shoe. So I put it in another book. Put it on the floor. You cannot start eating from the large bowl of shirayim if you haven't cooked it. So just roll up out of it. But they can only eat it after they put the pizza on the staff and they went on the staff.